I've been getting a lot of people asking me lately what my opinion of ATHLEAN-X is. He never even talks about progressive overload. He's a PT who has a little bit more knowledge on strength training than the average PT. There are also strength coaches who have a little bit more knowledge on rehab.
He shouldn't have said that.
Nope, definitely not.
Branching out is good.
Hey, it's Al here with
Extraordinary
Athletes, here helping you fit fitness even into the busiest of lives.
So don't forget to check out our other videos and playlists. Please subscribe to our channel and hit that bell notification button. It really helps us out. And today we are diving headfirst into a controversy, which involves Alec Enkiri, who has his own YouTube channel, and recently he put out a video criticizing Jeff Cavaliere over at Athleanx.
Which, as many of you may know, is one of our favorite fitness YouTube channels. Now, right off the bat, we just want to point out, this video is not going to be us just jumping into a fight or attacking anyone. In fact, we're not even going to offer a full critique of Alec's video or even offer rebuttals. In fact, James over at Shredded Sports Science actually did a fairly comprehensive video covering this.
In fact, Alec already responded to James's video, so if you want to see how that whole back and forth went, definitely check out both Alec and James's channels so you can see how that played out. Now, also full disclosure, we're really big fans of James and his Shredded Sports Science channel. But as always, we aren't here to be biased. In fact, what we're going to do instead is take the opportunity of this Athlean-X versus Alec Enkiri controversy and use it as an opportunity to talk about a very important concept for any lifter, whether you're beginner or advanced, and that is how best to understand progressive overload. And this issue relates to one particular criticism by Alec levied against Jeff in his initial video. Specifically, he alleges that Jeff does not mention progressive overload.
Now, we see this criticism as potentially promoting a very limited and problematic conception of progressive overload as merely adding weights to a bar on your lifts. But for the longevity of one's training career, progressive overload should actually be understood in a much fuller and broader sense, as consisting of many different types of tactics. In fact, progressive overload can actually be achieved through a myriad of different techniques and methods, such as increasing your training frequency, increasing your volume, utilizing different intensity techniques, etc., 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 all of which can be done without adding weight to your lift.
And so for us in this video, we're going to be taking a look at a few things. First, we'll explain Alec's criticism of the Athlean-X channel and show why it appears to suggest or convey the limited and what we see as the problematic version of progressive overload. Second, we'll provide a more robust explanation of progressive overload. Third, with the broader definition of progressive overload in hand, we'll list 8 ways to achieve progressive overload other than by adding weights. We'll also showcase and explain a couple of our favorites. Fourth, we'll explain why understanding progressive overload in this broader fashion is crucial for anyone who intends to train themselves seriously in the long run. And finally, we'll wrap up with some final remarks about what this more robust understanding of progressive overload means for Alec's criticism about Jeff Cavaliere's content. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started.
Okay, first off, we should acknowledge that Alec actually already apologized for this particular criticism. Initially, he had suggested that Jeff barely even mentions progressive overload.
He never even talks about progressive overload. I searched and I searched and I searched, and I think I found one video where he used the term like one time without really going into any detail about it at all.
However, he has since acknowledged that if he had done a bit more thorough research, he would have actually found many more videos where Jeff does, in fact, mention progressive overload. So he did apologize about this. Now, if we define progressive overload in an overly simplistic manner as merely adding weight to your lifts, then it's actually kind of true that Jeff doesn't really mention this in a lot of his videos. But a YouTube fitness channel would actually be fairly boring if every video was about this.
Hey everyone, today we're gonna add some weight to our deadlifts. Welcome back. Today we're adding another 10 pounds to our deadlifts. So we're back here again. You guessed it, adding more weights to a deadlift.
I think you get the point. But this is actually based on a huge misconception about what progressive overload actually is. Just because Jeff isn't talking about adding weights to your lift in each of his videos doesn't mean that he isn't showcasing progressive overload. And that's because progressive overload should actually be understood in a broader sense as creating a stimulus for your muscles that forces adaptations. And adopting this broader sense of progressive overload is actually quite crucial because, let's be honest, one's ability to just keep stacking on weights to your lifts is gonna come to a sharp halt. And given this broader understanding, you'll actually see that there's many different ways to achieve progressive overload other than just adding weight. You can, for instance, lessen the amount of rest between your sets. Change your rep tempo. Utilize a variety of intensity techniques. Improve your range of motion. Improve your form, control, and effort in a lift. Increase your reps. Increase your sets. And even increase your training frequency throughout the week. Brett Contreras actually has a great article covering a lot of this, and we'll link to that in the description below. For us, we're actually going to showcase a couple of our favorite of these progressive overload tactics. But first, a quick caveat here. We aren't saying that Alec necessarily believes in this more limited and problematic conception of progressive overload. In fact, Alec seems like someone who's quite well versed in his training knowledge, so he's probably fully aware of what we're talking about. But what we are saying is that his initial criticism that Jeff's channel lacked progressive overload appears to be mistakenly applying this more limited and less robust sense of progressive overload. Because when you actually understand it in the more fuller sense, you'll quickly realize that a lot of Jeff's videos showcase progressive overload, including many of the examples we just listed. This is actually an important point about the Athlean-X channel that we're going to return to later in this video. However, first, we're going to get into showcasing 2 examples of progressive overload that were just on our list. Then, we're going to get into why it's so important that you diversify your progressive overloading tactics. And then finally, we'll sum up and wrap up by giving our final thoughts on this whole Athlean-X versus Alec controversy.
Progressive overload tactic number 1, less rest between sets. The first progressive overload tactic that we're going to cover today is adjusting the rest period in between sets. Now, it's a huge annoyance of mine to see individuals at the gym taking ridiculously long breaks in between their sets. I've seen many individuals take out their phone in between their sets and then lose track of time, and they're just sitting at that same machine for hours on end. I've even borne witness to someone taking out a book and reading in between their sets. There's really no reason why you should have time for all of this during your workout. But apart from it being a pet peeve of mine, it's also an area where one can progressively overload without just adding more weights to your lift. In fact, reducing the resting periods in between your sets can introduce something new and challenging to your muscles and make it very difficult even without adding more weights. You may notice that on your first attempt of trying this tactic, you may struggle to even complete the full amount of reps on your last set for your normal working weight. Now, we should note that a full explanation of optimal resting periods between sets for strength and hypertrophy, that is beyond the scope of this video. However, while it is true that taking ridiculously long breaks is not in your best interest, there's been a lot of recent research as well talking about how taking too short of a break, that's 1 minute or less, may also not be optimal for hypertrophic gains. So definitely be mindful of this when attempting this progressive overload tactic.
Progressive overload tactic number 2, intensity techniques. Another way to attempt progressive overload and to create that new stimulus for your muscles is to implement intensity techniques. And there are honestly a lot of these out there, and while we do mention a few, our list is far from exhaustive. And an important thing to keep in mind for these is that it might require some training acumen to know how and when to properly implement these in your training, so it's something important to keep in mind. However, when these are properly utilized, they can be a really fun thing to add into your training, can make you feel very rewarded when you do them, and give you a really great pump. And while we won't go into great detail on how to best perform these techniques, 3 of our favorites include forced reps, drop sets, and isometric holds. A forced rep is an attempt to have you train past failure by having your spotter aid you by lifting a small percentage of the weight in order to give you those extra reps. But there are two important things to keep in mind when attempting this forced rep. And the first thing is that you're going to want to keep it for your final set, because if you do it too early on, you're going to affect your ability for subsequent sets. And secondly, you're really going to want a training partner that you can trust. First off, because you don't want to get crushed by a weight when they're helping you out. But secondly, you also don't want them to make the common mistake of taking too much weight off of you, because that defeats the whole purpose of the forced rep. And this is something that makes Kat very angry.
Okay, Kat, one more rep with my help. You got this.
Okay.
Nice! All right.
What was that? You did it for me!
So definitely make sure you have the right training partner for this particular technique. Another option is drop setting. Now this one's a particular favorite of mine. I just find it really fun. And basically what drop setting involves is completing a particular exercise and then progressively dropping the weight to a lighter weight in order to allow you to go past failure and do additional sets. There's been some controversy as to the extent to which drop sets should be used, but we see them as a great tool that, when properly utilized, can add additional or new stimulus to your training regimen. Again though, we'd recommend saving this particular tactic for your last set. And as for isometric holds, also known as static holds, these can be another really fun addition to your training regimen. So unlike the concentric or eccentric portion of a lift, an isometric involves the joint angle and the muscle length remaining static throughout the contraction. Like many intensity techniques, this will create real burn. Now we actually did a really fun isometric dumbbell hold challenge, so if you want to see who the winner was there, be sure to check that video out.
We just showcased two tactics of progressive overload that don't involve just adding weights to your lift, but there are many more examples. For instance, adjusting your frequency of training during the week so that you can take advantage of muscle protein synthesis has been getting a lot of traction in recent research. And we've previously listed many examples of other progressive overload tactics earlier in the video. But why are all these different types of progressive overload tactics so important? Well, actually, this is a key concept for any person who lifts weights. So you may be an extraordinary athlete who's just trying to be overall fitter, or you may be an elite athlete. To understand the concept of progressive overload is super important. Now, for a beginner, it may seem that you can keep on adding more and more weights every single week and get enormous gains. And this may be true for newbies. However, keep in mind that there will be a limit to this. It may not be feasible in the long run. You should not keep utilizing this particular tactic over and over again and expect to have the same great increases in your training as you did when you started. This approach may lead to a frustration in your training, a halt in your improvement as you hit a brick wall, or sometimes injuries. So keep that in mind as a beginner. For intermediate lifters, the proper and full conception of progressive overload is really important, because now just adding more weights every week isn't necessarily an option for you. And so you want the full array of the different tactics of progressive overload in your utility belt. This way, you can properly program your training so that you can get those gains while keeping your training really enjoyable as you overcome those inevitable plateaus. Now, as you become more advanced in lifting, this not only becomes vital, but also more complex. As Brett Contreras points out in an article we already mentioned, as you've been training for more and more years, you will have to be clever about your programming in order to continue to reach new levels of strength. You'll need to rotate your lifts, plan your program designs intelligently, fluctuate your training stress, and tinker around with methodologies. Eventually, it becomes very difficult to pack more pounds onto a particular lift or even gain another rep. So in sum, having a proper conception of progressive overload is important to any lifter out there, no matter who you are.
So we hope that we've been able to show why a more nuanced approach to what progressive overload is important. And we're not saying that Alec necessarily is unaware of this. However, in his criticisms of Jeff, and that Jeff's channel does not show progressive overload, he's implying a more simplistic approach to what progressive overload is. Because if you do take this more nuanced approach, It's really clear that Jeff actually talks about progressive overload a lot. In fact, he mentions a lot of things we have on our own list here. For example, concern over the frequency of your training.
The chest is also, because it's linked here and it's only once a week, may not be getting enough stimulation.
Or discussion about ranges of motion.
Partial range of motion versus full range of motion.
Or the tempo of your reps.
We can push it fast, we can push it slow.
Or different intensity techniques.
We can perform bench and drop sets. Today I've got my 8 best supersets that you're likely not doing. With the increased elasticity and tension on that band.
And honestly, there are so many more examples.
So remember, it's a mistake to assume that progressive overload is only being presented or showcased when Jeff or anyone explicitly mentions adding weight to the bar. In fact, as someone who prides himself on strength training while ensuring injury prevention, having this multifaceted approach to progressive overload makes a lot of sense for Jeff.
We hope you liked this video, and if you did, please share it. And if you are interested in us making a video going into more detail about the progressive overload tactics we mentioned here today, or if there are some tactics that we didn't mention and you want us to demonstrate it, let us know in the comments below and we will follow up.
Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.